This week we're going to take a look at and review multi-device design process goals and requirements. As we look at emerging technologies, the concept sort of implies that we're going to design user experiences across multiple devices. And so for this week, I want to get you thinking about your goals and requirements for your projects. And for example, if you started in GDS 72 or 70 with a website, you might think about your project, your final project for the class, being that you develop some task flows across your website as well as mobile and wearables. And we'll leave the last two projects for VR and AR as well as voice user interfaces just for the labs, unless you know enough about them on your own that you feel like you want to take a stab at producing it for your final project, in which case you want to let me know about that. The multi-process design, the multi-device design process is very appropriate, and sometimes clients figure out upfront that that needs to happen, and they'll advise you as the designer. For example, in this scenario, South Bay Football Incorporated specializes in soccer equipment apparel for local soccer league schools and teams. They already have a website, or they're scoping out the website. This is a wireframe of kind of what it might look like. But they've decided that they want an app as well that promotes their brand and increases sales, as well as providing the parents, players, and coaches with a utility of developing a community as well as managing teams and players. And they want to be able to do that across multiple devices, platforms, including smartwatches. And so it's important to start thinking about that those goals as well as the contexts in which the website and the community site and app tools might be utilized across multiple personas or users. The multi-device design process is pretty much like the design process that we've talked about and that you covered in other classes. We have to perform our discovery or discover our project and exactly the scope of it, defined the user profiles or personas, the specifications and requirements for the application, and as I mentioned earlier, we'll talk about this next week as well, the context of the usage, and then designing and developing and testing a solution in which you iterate and design and develop and test and then revise, and then finally delivering across multiple devices. So let's talk about discover and define, because this is where you should start brainstorming your final project. Go back to your original documentation and look at the problem that your project or your application solved. What were the business goals and requirements? For example, the problem is that we want to improve sales for the soccer website, right? And we want to do that as well as provide utility for the users in the hopes that that would increase our sales. And then take a look and revisit your user personas and start to think about how might those users utilize your original application in different contexts. What does that mean? That means basically that a user might, especially in this day and age, start with an app that's on the desktop, and then as they move to say commuting home, they might want to look at the same app to get data, for example. So the context changes. And what does that mean with respect to the specifications and the interaction design? And they might even further change their context by accessing data and information on smartwatches or other wearables. So think about your original specifications. How does that change across multiple contexts? And what changes would you make in the creative brief and in your comps? The idea is that as we look across these multiple devices, that we want to get to the minimum viable product, and that's usually via design sprints. But I don't want you to go there just yet. Start thinking about your original problem, business goals and requirements, the user personas and specifications, particularly across mobile, wearable, or other solutions. Keep in mind that there are 4 approaches to interaction design, and this is covered in your reading. They're user-centered, activity-centered, and system-centered, and then rapid design. And they discuss them as if they're actually separate approaches, but I actually think that they're integrated. In fact, activity-centered, system-centered, and rapid design are really subsets of user-centered design, in my opinion, and based on other research that's been done. And so it's important that we first start and look at our user goals because they're going to drive the design. And then in terms of activity centered, what behaviors surround a task or goal that our users have? And in terms of system centered, we want to focus on the context of the needs and tasks that they accomplish. Like, for example, where are they accomplishing them? When are they accomplishing them? And does that imply a different solution or device depending on the context of usage? And then, of course, the rapid design based on the previous approaches and rapidly designing a viable product. So user-centered design sits on the top and the highest level hierarchy in terms of interaction design, whereas I think we've all somewhat agreed that although the user is king in user experience design, user experience design is overarching, in which user-centered design is a subset, as well as interaction and interface design. But as we approach interaction design with the user-centered design focus, we want to give attention to our users, tasks, and the context. As I said, think about that. That's extremely important to keep in mind. And we're going to use empirical measurement and testing. And if we're focused on the users, then we're doing user interviews and research, and then testing, and then we're iterating in our designs. Focusing on users, tasks, and context means that we need to develop our personas, but perform the contextual analysis. And this is probably something that we did a little bit in 70, but we didn't emphasize. And one way that we can get a sense for the different contexts of usage and how that might imply multi-device design is to do user story mapping. And I've given you some references for user story mapping, and we're going to take another look at it next week and try to map out not just the user story and the persona and what their goals are, the activities and tasks that they accomplish over time, but also how the context might possibly change. So for the next module, this has been a short video. For the next module, again, I want you to think about your particular project. What problem is it solving? What are the goals and requirements? Who are the users? And then specifications. Now, requirements aren't necessarily specifications. Requirements could be more broad, right? Like such as increasing sales, building a website with e-commerce features, as well as building a community, providing utility for the customers and users, and such as soccer moms, the players, coaches, etc. And then looking at those requirements and the user needs and personas, and as well as the context, perhaps maybe doing some story mapping and developing specifications for the features or that might be included in the app across multiple devices and across the context of use. And that's a lot to do, but start thinking about it, because as we progress over the next 2 weeks or so and we dive deep into mobile and then into smartwatch, then you'll have a better idea of what features and controls that you might include in the devices and keeping a consistent experience across the devices.